Chapter 1. The Door That Should Have Been Mine. The war didn't end when Steve Nash boarded the transport home. It clung to him. Sand ground into the seams of his boots. The smell of fuel and burned metal still trapped in his nose. The weight of responsibility riding his shoulders like a second rucksack. He'd left early, pulled strings, cashed favors he didn't plan to ever repay. All for this moment. Home. The taxi rolled away, its engine noise fading, leaving Steve alone at the curb with a duffel bag in his hand and a knot in his chest that felt suspiciously like excitement. The house looked the same from the outside. White siding, blue shutters. The porch light he'd installed himself, still crooked from when Toby kicked a soccer ball too hard and cracked the bracket. Steve smiled despite himself. He didn't call ahead. He wanted the surprise, the door flying open, Toby launching himself at Steve's legs, Deborah's hands covering her mouth before she ran to him. That picture had played in his head during the worst nights overseas, when sleep came in fragments and gunfire echoed through his dreams. He climbed the steps, set his bag down, and knocked. Footsteps answered almost immediately. Confident ones. Unhurried. The door opened. Steve's smile froze. A man stood there, mid-30s, clean-cut, well-fed. Not startled. Not confused. Comfortable. He leaned casually against the frame, one hand on the door, the other holding a coffee mug Steve recognized instantly. It was the one Deborah bought him for Father's Day. And draped over the man's shoulders was Steve's robe. The gray one. The stupid, worn thing Toby used to tug on when he wanted to be carried. For a second, Steve thought he'd knocked on the wrong house. I think, Steve started, glancing over his shoulder at the house number. It matched. I think I've got the wrong place. The man looked him up and down slowly, eyes flicking to the duffel, the boots, the short-cropped hair that hadn't seen a proper barber in months. His expression didn't change. No, the man said. Calm. Almost bored. You're at the right address. Steve's grip tightened on the strap of his bag. Then who the hell are you? The man smiled faintly. You're at the wrong house. The words didn't register at first. They floated there, absurd, like a joke without a punchline. This is my house, Steve said. He tried to keep his voice level, measured the way he'd been trained. My wife lives here. My son. A shadow moved behind the man. Deborah stepped into view. She looked rested. Her hair was styled, her makeup light and intentional. She wasn't wearing the oversized sweater Steve remembered or the tired expression that used to crease her face when she was juggling work and parenting alone. She looked good. She didn't look surprised. Steve, she said, like she'd been expecting him next week. Or next year. The man stepped aside without being asked. Like this was normal. Like he belonged there. Deborah moved forward until she stood in the doorway, one hand resting casually on the frame. She didn't reach for Steve. Didn't smile. Didn't frown. You weren't supposed to be back yet, she said. Steve stared at her. His mouth opened. Closed. What is this? He asked finally. Who is he? This, she said calmly, is Donald. Donald lifted his mug in a lazy half-wave. He lives here now, Deborah continued. You don't. The words hit harder than any explosion Steve had felt overseas. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just sudden and absolute. Steve took a step forward. Donald didn't move, but Deborah's eyes hardened. Don't, she said. Steve stopped, breath shallow. He looked past them, into the house. The living room furniture was different. New couch. New television. The family photos that once lined the hallway were gone. Toby, Steve called out instinctively. No answer. He swallowed. Where's my son? Deborah exhaled, almost annoyed, like he'd asked something inconvenient. He got sick, she said. Steve frowned. Sick? A couple months ago. The world narrowed. Why wasn't I told? You were deployed, she replied flatly. What was I supposed to do, stress you out? Steve took another step forward without realizing it. How sick? Deborah tilted her head, studying him, measuring how much to give. Leukemia. The word landed heavy, but Steve grabbed onto the next thought immediately. Okay, that's serious, but kids beat it all the time. Where's he? I need to see him. She smiled then. Not warm. Not cruel in the obvious way. Just satisfied. The doctor said he didn't have much of a chance, she said. Treatment was expensive. Hard on him. Steve's heart began to pound. What treatment? We stopped, she said simply. The silence that followed pressed in from all sides. You stopped, Steve repeated. Donald cleared his throat. It was a humane choice, he said. Dragging it out would have just... Steve looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something cold behind the polished exterior. Where's my son? Steve demanded. Deborah didn't look away, didn't flinch. He's gone, she said. Steve's knees threatened to buckle. Gone where? She smiled again, slow and deliberate. He's gone, Steve. Chapter 2. The Death I Wasn't Allowed to Fight. Steve didn't remember stepping inside the house, but suddenly he was there, standing on familiar hardwood floors that no longer felt familiar at all. The air smelled different. Some sharp, expensive cologne layered over the faint trace of coffee. Not his. None of it was his. Deborah closed the door behind him with a soft, deliberate click. Donald leaned against the kitchen counter like he was watching a conversation on television. Detached. Comfortable. Steve's eyes kept moving, scanning for signs of his son. A backpack by the stairs. A pair of sneakers kicked off carelessly. The corner of the couch where Toby liked to sprawl with his tablet. Nothing. Start talking, Steve said quietly. Deborah crossed her arms. Already told you. Toby got sick. You said leukemia, Steve replied. His voice was steady, almost clinical. What kind? She shrugged. I don't remember. The bad kind. There isn't a good kind, Steve said. Donald smirked into his mug. Deborah shot him a warning look, not for what he said, but for the interruption. It came on fast, she continued. Bruising. Nosebleeds. He was tired all the time. At first I thought he was faking it to get out of school. Steve's jaw tightened. When? Around 2 months ago. 2 months, Steve repeated. And you didn't tell me. You were in a war zone, she said, irritation creeping into her voice. What good would it have done? I'm his father. You were gone. Steve absorbed that without reaction. What did the doctors say? Deborah glanced toward the hallway, then back at him. They said the odds weren't great. Lots of hospital time, chemo, pain, and no guarantees. Steve nodded slowly. Kids survive leukemia every day. Donald laughed under his breath. You don't get it, do you? Steve ignored him. What hospital? Deborah's eyes narrowed. Why does that matter now? Because I want to know, Steve said. Because I should have been there. She exhaled sharply, like she was tired of explaining something obvious. We tried treatment at first. It was awful. He was miserable, crying, throwing up, begging to go home. Steve closed his eyes briefly. He pictured Toby with a fever, small hands clutching a hospital blanket. The image tried to break him. He didn't let it. So you stopped? Steve asked. Yes. On whose authority? Deborah lifted her chin. Mine. I'm his mother. And mine, Steve said. You needed my consent. You were unreachable. That's a lie. Donald finally stepped forward. Let me make this simple, he said. The kid was dying. We spare him the suffering. Steve turned to him slowly. You don't get to call my son the kid. Donald's smile thinned. Touchy. Deborah raised a hand. Enough. This isn't helping. Steve looked back at her. What happened after you stopped treatment? Deborah hesitated for the first time. He got worse, she said. Weak. Couldn't stay at home anymore. So where was he? Steve asked. Her eyes slid away. Where was my son? He was moved, she said. To county care. The words didn't make sense at first. Steve frowned. County care. The hospital social worker said we couldn't manage him properly, Deborah continued. The costs were getting out of control. They said the county could take over. You abandoned him, Steve said softly. Deborah bristled. That's not fair. You signed him over. We did what we had to do. Steve's hands curled slowly into fists, then relaxed again. Control. He focused on breathing. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. How long, he asked. How long what? How long was he there? Deborah swallowed. A few weeks. Steve stared at the floor. Weeks. Alone. Surrounded by strangers. Did he ask for me? Steve asked. Deborah looked at him, then really looked at him, and something flickered in her eyes. Yes, she said. Steve's chest tightened. When? All the time, she replied. Her voice was almost conversational. He kept asking when you were coming home. Kept shouting your name when the pain got bad. Donald shifted uncomfortably. Steve felt something press against his ribs, heavy and sharp. He forced it down. What did you tell him? Steve asked. Deborah shrugged. That you were busy. That you weren't coming. Steve nodded once. And when did he die? 2 weeks ago. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Steve steadied himself against the back of a chair. I want to see him, he said. Deborah shook her head. You can't. Why? Because he's already been buried. Steve looked up slowly. Buried where? Donald answered this time. Potter's Field. The word landed like a verdict. Steve stared at him. You put my son in a pauper's grave? It was efficient, Donald said. No point wasting money on. Stop, Deborah snapped, cutting him off. Steve didn't raise his voice. Didn't move. He just stood there, eyes fixed on Deborah. No funeral? He asked. There wasn't time, she said. No headstone. Deborah looked away. No goodbye, Steve continued. No chance for me to hold his hand. No chance to tell him I was coming home. Silence stretched between them. He died alone, Steve said. Deborah's voice was quiet when she answered. He wasn't alone. Nurses were there. Steve nodded slowly, as if accepting a tactical briefing. Did he say anything at the end? Steve asked. Deborah hesitated, then sighed. He kept calling for you. Wouldn't stop. Steve closed his eyes. The house felt smaller. The walls pressed in. Every memory he'd carried back from war, every promise he'd made to himself to come home alive, collapsed into a single, unbearable truth. He had survived everything, and still lost his son. Steve opened his eyes again. His face was pale but composed. Where is he? He asked. Deborah folded her arms tighter. I told you. Potter's Field. Steve nodded once. No anger. No shouting. Just a quiet, irrevocable understanding. No goodbye. No choice. No dignity. Chapter 3. A household, a family liquidated. Steve stood in the living room like a guest who had overstayed his welcome, hands hanging at his sides, eyes moving slowly from corner to corner. The house knew him, or it used to, but now it felt indifferent, rearranged to forget. The couch was new. The rug, too. The framed photos that once charted Toby's height against the hallway wall were gone. The faint outlines of nail holes spackled and painted over with a carelessness that suggested haste. Where are my things? Steve asked. Deborah didn't answer right away. She moved toward the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, took a measured sip. Donald leaned against the island, watching Steve with a look that bordered on amusement. Your things, Deborah repeated. Most of them are gone. Gone where? Storage. Some donated. Steve nodded, absorbing it piece by piece. My uniforms. Deborah shrugged. I didn't see the point in keeping them. Donald laughed. They were taking up space. Steve looked at him. You wear my robe. Donald glanced down at himself, then back up, smiling. Fits, doesn't it? Steve turned away before the words could find their way out of him. He walked toward the hallway, toward the bedroom that used to be his. The door was closed. He opened it. The bed was different. New frame. New sheets. The dresser where Deborah once kept her jewelry was gone entirely. The closet doors slid open to reveal clothes that weren't his, tailored jackets, polished shoes, a neat row of ties in colors Steve never wore. He stood there, breathing evenly, cataloging the losses the way he would assess a compromised position. You can't just erase me, Steve said from the doorway. Deborah appeared behind him. You erased yourself when you chose the military. Steve turned slowly. I chose to provide for my family. And I chose not to wait, she replied. We needed stability. Donald's footsteps sounded behind them. Which I provided, he said. Steve stepped back into the hall. The locks were changed. Yes, Deborah said. After the divorce. Steve's head snapped up. The what? She crossed her arms. The divorce. It was finalized last month. That's impossible, Steve said. I never signed anything. You didn't need to, Deborah replied. I had power of attorney. The words landed clean and sharp. You used it to divorce me? Steve asked. To move forward, she said. You were unreachable. That's a lie, Steve said again, more firmly this time. Donald cleared his throat. Legally, everything's sound. You should talk to a lawyer. Steve looked at him. Did you buy this house? Donald smiled. I did. Deborah's chin lifted slightly. It made sense. The market was good, and you weren't coming back. Steve felt something settle in his chest. Not pain, not rage. Wait, cold and precise. You sold it, Steve said. Our house. Our house stopped being ours a long time ago, Deborah replied. I sold it. Donald bought it. Clean transaction. Steve nodded once. And the money? Deborah didn't answer. Donald did. Cleared the mortgage. Renovations. Some investments. Steve looked at Deborah. Toby's insurance. Her eyes flicked to Donald, then back. Yes. Steve exhaled slowly. How much? Donald smiled. Enough. Steve took a step closer. You cashed it out already. It was processed quickly, Donald said. Efficient paperwork. Steve's jaw tightened. You planned it. Deborah scoffed. Planned what? My absence, Steve said. The timing. The insurance. Everything. Donald shrugged. That's business. Steve laughed quietly once. My son isn't business. He was sick, Deborah said, and the money helped. Steve looked at her, searching for something, anything, that resembled the woman he'd married. Helped who? Deborah's expression hardened. Don't do this. Do what? Make me the villain, she snapped. I held everything together while you played hero overseas. Steve didn't raise his voice. You abandoned our child. Donald stepped between them. Careful. Steve met his eyes. Or what? Donald's smile vanished for a second. Then it returned, polished. You don't live here anymore. Steve glanced around. I can see that. Deborah sighed, as if exhausted by the conversation. Toby's death was tragic, but necessary. The treatments were brutal. There was no guarantee. There's never a guarantee, Steve said. That doesn't mean you quit. You weren't there, she shot back. You didn't watch him suffer. Steve's voice dropped. You didn't let me. Silence filled the space between them. Donald broke it with a chuckle. You soldiers always think everything's a battle. Sometimes it's just numbers. Steve turned to him. You profited from my son's death. Donald didn't deny it. I invested the payout wisely. Steve looked back at Deborah. You signed the papers. Yes, she said. I did. Steve nodded again. He noticed then the small details, the new art on the walls, the upgraded appliances, the subtle signs of money moving through the house like blood through a body. You mocked my service, Steve said quietly. While I was gone, Deborah's lips curled slightly. I called it what it was. An excuse. Donald laughed. She has a point. Steve's eyes never left Deborah. You replaced me. She met his gaze without hesitation. I upgraded. The word hung there, ugly and final. Steve felt the last fragile illusion fall away. There would be no apology, no sudden remorse, no crack in the story they'd rehearsed. This was never about love, Steve said. It was about leverage. Donald tilted his head. Smart man. Steve reached down, picked up his duffel bag, and slung it over his shoulder. He took one last look at the house, not with longing, not with anger, but with clarity. You didn't just take my place, Steve said. You liquidated my family. Deborah turned away. Donald raised his mug in a mock toast. Steve walked toward the door, every step measured, controlled. The grief was still there, heavy, crushing, but it no longer ruled him. It had hardened into something else. Cold clarity. Chapter 4. The nurse who didn't look away. Steve didn't sleep that night. Or the next. Grief tried to drag him under in waves. Images of Toby's laugh, his lopsided grin, but Steve treated it the way he'd treated fear in combat. He acknowledged it, logged it, set aside. There would be time later. Right now, there was work to do. He started where he still had leverage. The VA. The building smelled like disinfectant and burnt coffee, the same as it always had. Steve sat rigid in a plastic chair, hands folded, eyes forward, while a clerk typed his name into a computer. You're back early, she said, glancing up. Yes, ma'am. Sorry to hear about your son. Steve's jaw tightened. I need his records. She hesitated. That's complicated. I have full parental rights, Steve said evenly. Or I did. She studied his face for a long second, then sighed. I'll see what I can do. Files trickled in slowly. Redacted pages. Gaps where there shouldn't be gaps. Dates that didn't line up. Steve spread them across a table in the VA library, scanning with the same attention he used to clear rooms. He saw the first crack then. A progress note. Early chemotherapy response. Improve counts. A handwritten margin note that read, responding better than expected. Steve's finger traced the words. Better than expected. That wasn't dying. He took the records to a retired VA physician he knew, Dr. Callahan, a man who owed Steve more than one favor. Callahan flipped through the pages, brow furrowing deeper with each turn. This doesn't make sense, he muttered. Explain it to me, Steve said. The treatment stopped too soon, Callahan replied. And these numbers, he tapped the page. These are good. For leukemia, especially in children, these are very good. So why stop? Steve asked. Callahan leaned back, uneasy. Someone with authority made the call. Steve thanked him and left. Next stop was social services. The waiting room was cramped and loud, children crying, parents arguing, phones ringing nonstop. Steve waited until a caseworker finally called his name. I'm looking for information on my son, Steve said, laying out the facts without emotion. Toby Nash, 8 years old, leukemia, transferred to county care. The caseworker's expression shifted. Are you the father? Yes. She swallowed. I'll get a supervisor. They made him wait again, then longer. Finally, a woman in her 50s appeared, hair pulled back tight, eyes tired. Mr. Nash, she said quietly. I'm sorry. Don't, Steve replied. Just tell me what happened. She nodded, leading him into a small office and closing the door. Your son was placed under temporary county guardianship after his mother signed consent. Medical authority was transferred. Steve's voice stayed calm. Who oversaw his care? The supervisor hesitated. A CPS nurse. Rita Hopkins. Where can I find her? Another pause. Then, reluctantly, she's still employed. I can reach out. 2 days later, Steve sat across from Rita Hopkins in a quiet diner off the highway. She was in her 40s, hair streaked with gray, eyes that looked like they hadn't slept properly in years. Her coffee sat untouched. I wasn't sure you'd come, she said. I wasn't sure you'd agree, Steve replied. She met his gaze. I stayed with your son. The words hit him like a hand to the chest. Thank you. Rita nodded once. He shouldn't have been there. What? Steve asked. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded notebook. Because he wasn't dying. Steve leaned forward. His response to treatment was remarkable, she continued. Not perfect, not guaranteed, but promising. Very promising. How promising? Steve asked. Rita hesitated, then said it anyway. 90% survival with continued care. The diner noise faded to a dull hum. 90, Steve repeated. Yes. Steve swallowed. Then why? Because someone stopped it, Rita said, her voice firm now. Not medically, administratively. Steve's hands clenched under the table. Boo, she shook her head. I don't know. The paperwork came down clean. Too clean. Consent forms already signed. Decisions already made. By my wife, Steve said. And influenced by someone else, Rita added quietly. Steve looked up. Donald Fox. Rita didn't argue. He asked about insurance timelines, she continued. A lot. Kept wanting to know how long children usually lasted. When payouts happened, Steve closed his eyes briefly. He visited once, Rita said. Didn't touch Toby, didn't speak to him, just watched. Steve opened his eyes. And Toby, Rita's voice softened. He asked for you every day. Steve felt the room tilt, but he stayed upright. Tell me. He kept saying you were coming, she said. That you promised. Steve nodded. He had. When the pain got bad, Rita continued. He'd call your name. Over and over. Like it anchored him. Steve's breath hitched once. He controlled it. Did he understand? Steve asked. Did he know? Rita shook her head. No. He thought you were busy. That you were fighting to get home. Steve stared at the tabletop. I know, she said. Silence stretched between them, heavy but honest. They stopped his treatment while he was improving, Rita said finally. That's the truth. And I will say that to anyone who asks. Steve looked at her, eyes steady. Will you say it again? Yes, she said without hesitation. Steve nodded once. The last piece slid into place, not with rage, not with chaos, but with a terrible, perfect clarity. This wasn't fate. This wasn't loss. This was a choice. Toby wasn't dying. He was improving. His survival odds were high. Treatment was stopped deliberately, and Toby died calling his father's name. Chapter 5. Insurance moves faster than medicine. Steve treated the paperwork the way he treated a hostile map. Laid it all out, marked the gaps, circled what didn't belong. The kitchen table of the cheap motel became his command post. Receipts, copies, redacted records, sticky notes with dates and names. He worked in silence, jaw set, eyes moving with purpose. The insurance statement sat at the center. He'd requested it the same way he'd requested everything else, politely, precisely, relentlessly. When it arrived, he read it twice without blinking. Payout. Processed in 11 days. Steve exhaled slowly. 11 days was fast. Too fast. Especially for a child's death. Especially with a cancer diagnosis involved. There were always delays. Reviews. Questions. He flipped the page. Authorization stamps. Digital signatures. Clean, he murmured. Too clean. He picked up the phone and dialed the number at the bottom of the statement. Claims department. A woman answered. How may I help you? My name is Steve Nash, he said. I'm calling about policy 4472, my son's. A pause. Typing. I see the file, she said. How can I assist? I'm trying to understand the timeline, Steve replied. When was the claim submitted? Same day as the death certificate, she said. Steve closed his eyes. And approved? Within 72 hours. Who expedited it? Another pause. Mr. Fox, she said. Donald Fox. Steve opened his eyes. On what grounds? Hardship, she replied. And complete documentation. Steve thanked her and hung up. Hardship. He pulled out the medical consent forms next. The copies Rita had quietly slipped him. He laid them side by side with older versions he'd obtained through the VA. The signatures matched Deborah's name, looped and confident, but the dates didn't. One consent form approving withdrawal of treatment was dated 3 days before a progress note that read continued improvement. Steve circled it in red. Impossible, he said softly. He drove to the hospital the next morning. The administrator's office was all glass and polished steel. Steve waited until he was called in, then sat across from a man in a tailored suit who smiled too easily. I'm reviewing my son's case, Steve said. I have questions. The administrator nodded. I'm sorry for your loss. Save it, Steve replied. I want to know why treatment was stopped while his numbers were improving. The smile faded. That decision was made by the legal guardian. Under pressure, Steve said. The administrator shifted. We follow consent. Steve slid the documents across the desk, then explained these timestamps. The man frowned, flipping pages. I need to consult. Donald Fox consulted you, Steve interrupted. Didn't he? Silence. He asked about insurance timelines. Steve continued. About how long children usually survive after withdrawal. About when death certificates are issued. That's not medical, Steve finished. That's financial. The administrator leaned back, folding his hands. Mr. Nash, I can't discuss internal communications. Steve stood. You already have. He left before security could be called. Outside, he sat in his car and stared at the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. He didn't scream, didn't hit anything. Rage would blur the edges. He needed them sharp. He spent the afternoon calling doctors whose names appeared in the margins of Toby's file. Most declined to speak. One agreed to meet, reluctantly, in a parking garage after dark. Dr. Henson looked like a man carrying a secret too heavy for his frame. I was told the decision was final, Henson said, eyes darting. That consent had been given. By whom? Steve asked. The mother, Henson replied. And her partner. Did you object? Henson hesitated. I raised concerns. And I was reminded of liability, Henson said quietly. Of protocol. Steve nodded. Did Fox contact you directly? Yes. What did he ask? Henson swallowed. He wanted estimates. Time frames. Worst case scenarios. Steve's voice stayed level. Did he ask when the child would die? Henson closed his eyes. He asked how long it usually takes. Steve thanked him and walked away. Back at the motel, Steve pinned a timeline to the wall with tape. He wrote dates in black marker, drawing arrows between them. Diagnosis. Treatment begins. Improvement noted. Insurance policy reviewed. Consent altered. Treatment stopped. County transfer. Death. Payout. The arrows formed a straight line. He noticed something else then. Donald's calls clustered around one point. The moment improvement was documented. Steve picked up his phone and scrolled through old emails, messages Deborah had sent while he was deployed. He'd ignored the small changes in tone at the time. Now they glared. It's expensive. We can't keep doing this. Donald says there's another way. Another way. Steve opened his laptop and pulled property records. The house sale date sat 2 weeks after Toby's death. The renovation permits followed days later. Insurance moved faster than medicine. He leaned back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The image of Toby in a hospital gown tried to force its way in. Steve let it come, just long enough to see the 4-line, the small chest rising and falling. Then he set aside. He drove past the cemetery that evening. Potter's Field lay quiet behind a chain-link fence. No headstones, just numbered markers in the dirt. Steve parked and sat there until the sun dipped low. This wasn't an accident, he said aloud, voice steady in the empty car. He thought of Donald's questions, of Deborah's signatures, of the speed with which money had moved when care had slowed. This wasn't neglect. It was orchestration. Toby didn't lose a fight. He was removed from it. Chapter 6, the pattern behind the man. Steve stopped thinking of Donald Fox as a man and started thinking of him as a file. Files could be opened, cross-referenced, broken down into parts small enough to understand. He began at the public library, because public places were where people forgot to be careful. He sat at a terminal in the corner, back straight, hand steady, pulling marriage licenses and property transfers the way he once pulled reconnaissance photos. Donald Fox had been married 4 times. Deborah was number 4. Steve wrote the names down in a notebook, 1 per page. Dates, cities, counties. He didn't rush. Rushing created mistakes. The first wife had died in a car accident. Single vehicle collision. Late at night. Donald had been out of town. Insurance paid within weeks. The second wife died of a sudden illness. Complications. No autopsy requested. Life insurance payout flagged as expedited. The third wife's child, 6 years old, had passed away after a fall down a staircase. Donald had remarried within a year. Steve stared at the screen for a long time. For marriages, 3 deaths, 2 dead children, 1 living man who always walked away richer. He printed what he could and drove across town to the county records office. The clerk behind the counter was young, bored, and grateful for someone polite. "I'm researching a family history," Steve said. "Fox." The clerk typed, frowned, typed again. "That's a lot of activity," she said. "Is it?" Steve asked. She hesitated. "More than usual." Property records told their own story. Each marriage was followed by asset consolidation, joint accounts, power of attorney, then death, then liquidation. Steve traced the pattern with his finger on the page. Acquire, consolidate, remove, collect. He closed his eyes briefly. That afternoon, he drove to a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town. The address belonged to Donald's second wife, would have been her address. The house was small, tidy, with a garden that had been left to grow wild. An older woman answered the door. "Yes?" she asked, suspicious. "My name is Steve Nash," he said. "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm asking about Margaret Fox." The woman's face changed, tightened. She looked over Steve's shoulder, then back at him. "You're late," she said. "Late for what?" Steve asked. "For the truth," she replied, opening the door wider. "Come in." Her living room smelled of dust and old paper. Photos lined the walls. Margaret as a girl, Margaret as a bride. No photos of Donald. He was charming, the woman said, following Steve's gaze. "Always knew what to say." "When did you first feel something was wrong?" Steve asked. She laughed bitterly. "The day after the funeral." Steve didn't interrupt. "He asked about paperwork before the flowers wilted," she continued. "Kept talking about what Margaret would have wanted. Did you report your suspicions?" Steve asked. She shook her head. Who would have listened? The doctor signed off. The police closed the case. Steve nodded. He'd heard this before. Different words. Same shape. He thanked her and left. Over the next week, Steve followed the trail across towns and counties. Each stop added another layer. Another whisper. At a diner near the highway, a former neighbor leaned across the table and said, "We all thought it was strange. Kids don't just die that often." At a church office, a volunteer lowered her voice. "There was a fundraiser once. You shut it down. Said it would complicate things." At a bar where Donald used to drink, a bartender snorted. "Guy always talked about risk like it was a game. Said life was about timing." Everywhere Steve went, people told him the same thing. They'd noticed. They'd suspected. They'd stayed quiet. "Why?" Steve asked one man who'd lived next door to Donald's third wife. The man shrugged. He had lawyers, money, friends in the right places. Steve wrote that down too. He drove past Donald's old houses one by one. Each looked normal, safe, suburban, places where children should have grown up. Instead, they were markers. That night, Steve spread everything out on the motel bed. Photos, records, notes, names circled in red. The pattern was undeniable now. Donald didn't marry for love. He married for access. He didn't wait for tragedy. He positioned himself for it. Steve replayed every interaction he'd had with Donald, every word spoken in that house. The casual cruelty, the ease with which he talked about death. He hadn't been improvising. He'd been repeating a script. Steve picked up the phone and called a number he'd found buried in an old settlement document. A lawyer who'd represented one of Donald's former families. The lawyer's voice was tired when he answered. "I can't discuss former clients." "I'm not asking about clients," Steve said. "I'm asking about a pattern." Silence. "You saw it," Steve continued. "You just couldn't prove it." Another pause. "Be careful," the lawyer said finally. "Fox doesn't like loose ends." Steve hung up. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped, breathing slow and even. This wasn't about Deborah anymore. She was a symptom. Donald was the disease. He wasn't evil in the dramatic sense. He didn't rage or threaten. He didn't leave blood on his hands where anyone could see it. He engineered outcomes. He let systems do the killing for him. Steve looked at the notebook, at the names of the dead wives, the children, the quiet settlements that followed. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't coincidence. Donald Fox wasn't evil by accident. He was practiced. Chapter 7, The Mothers Who Remember. Steve found Denise Marr's number tucked inside a brittle manila folder, handwritten in the margin of a settlement document that had never seen a courtroom. No address, no email, just a phone number and a note that read, "Mother." Wouldn't sign. He dialed once. It rang until it didn't. He dialed again an hour later. This time, a voice answered, thin, cautious, sharpened by years of being careful. "Yes. My name is Steve Nash," he said. "I'm calling about your daughter." Silence followed. Not confusion. Recognition. "You shouldn't be calling me," Denise said. "I know," Steve replied. "I wouldn't if I had another way." Another pause. He could hear breathing on the line. Measured. Controlled. "Where are you?" she asked. Steve told her. "Wait there," Denise said. "I'll come to you." She arrived just after dusk, driving an older sedan that bore the dents of long use. She didn't shake his hand when she got out. She studied him first, his posture, the stillness in his eyes, the way he stood like he expected trouble, even in a quiet parking lot. "You look like a soldier," she said. "I am," Steve replied. She nodded once. "Then you'll understand why I don't trust anyone." They went to a diner nearby, one of those places that stayed open because it had nowhere else to go. They sat in a booth by the window. Denise ordered tea. Steve ordered nothing. "My daughter's name was Ellen," Denise began, staring into her cup. "She married Donald when she was 27. Smart girl. Kind. Too kind." Steve didn't interrupt. "He was generous at first," Denise continued. "Paid off her loans. Bought her a house. Told everyone how lucky he was." She laughed softly, without humor. He always told the story like he was the prize. "What happened?" Steve asked. "She got sick," Denise said. "Not terminal. Not even rare. Complications, they said." Steve waited. "I asked for an autopsy," Denise went on. "They told me it wasn't necessary. Donald said Ellen wouldn't have wanted it." Steve's jaw tightened. And then Denise said, the paperwork started moving. Faster than grief ever does. Insurance. Assets. Accounts. Steve had heard this rhythm before. It matched the beat he'd been following for weeks. Did you report it? Steve asked. I tried, she said. The police said there was no evidence. The hospital said everything was by the book. A judge told me to stop harassing a grieving widower. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her cup. I didn't stop, she said. I just learned to whisper. Steve nodded. I kept records, Denise continued. Clipped articles. Obituaries. Notices. I noticed names repeating. Towns overlapping. She reached in her purse and slid a folded stack of papers across the table. Steve unfolded them carefully. Names. Dates. Connections he'd already seen, now confirmed by a living witness. They told me I was imagining patterns, Denise said. That grief makes people see things. Steve looked up. It doesn't. She met his eyes. Something passed between them then, recognition. Relief. He killed her, Denise said quietly. I know it. I've always known it. Steve didn't argue. He didn't need to. They compromised people, she continued. Doctors. Administrators. Quiet payments. Promises of protection. Did anyone else suspect? Steve asked. Denise nodded. More than you think. She pulled out her phone and scrolled. Names appeared on the screen. Numbers without labels. They don't meet in public, she said. They don't talk to police. But they remember. That night, Steve met them. One by one. They arrived at the diner. Older women mostly, some men, faces etched with a long work of grief. They didn't sit together at first. They ordered coffee. Took corners. Watched the door. Denise made introductions quietly. This is Steve, she said. He lost a child. That was all it took. A woman with red-rimmed eyes leaned forward. Mine too. Another nodded. Not as biological, but she stopped, swallowed. He raised her. Until he didn't. They spoke in fragments at first. Half stories. Glances exchanged for permission. He asked about timing. He didn't want donations. He said funerals were unnecessary. He told me to move on. Steve listened. Took notes only when asked. Asked questions only when needed. You all suspected, he said eventually. They nodded. Why didn't you come forward together? Steve asked. A man at the end of the table laughed bitterly. Together to who? Silence answered him. They had money, another woman said. Lawyers. Influence. And we had children in the ground, Denise added. Steve felt the shift then. The weight in the room wasn't just grief anymore. It was pressure, compressed, dangerous. I'm not law enforcement, Steve said carefully. I can't promise protection. Denise leaned forward. We're not asking for promises. The woman with red eyes spoke again. We just don't want to be alone anymore. Steve nodded. You're not. They began to trade documents. Photos. Letters that had never been mailed. Medical notes that never made sense until now. A pattern assembled itself on the table. Ugly, undeniable. This isn't one crime, Steve said quietly. It's a method. Denise's mouth set in a hard line. Then methods can be broken. The diner's neon sign flickered outside. A waitress refilled cups without asking questions. Steve looked around the table at the faces that had been dismissed, silenced, minimized. You've been carrying this alone, he said. Not anymore, Denise replied. Phones were exchanged. Secure numbers. Agreements made without ceremony. No speeches. No vows. Just understanding. As the night thinned, they stood to leave one by one. Denise lingered. You're dangerous to him, she said softly. Steve met her gaze. So is the truth. She nodded, then let it move. Steve stepped out into the night air, the quiet humming with something new. Not vengeance. Not chaos. Alignment. Grief, no longer isolated, had found structure. And in that structure, resolve took shape. Chapter 8. The files he never meant me to see. Steve watched the house from across the street, the way he used to watch villages before entering them, patient, still, cataloging patterns. Cars lined the curb now. Voices drifted through open windows. Laughter. Music. A dinner party. Donald Fox-like witnesses when he felt untouchable. Steve waited until the rhythm settled. Until guests were deep into their second drinks. Until attention softened and edges dulled. He didn't rush. Timing mattered more than speed. He crossed the lawn the way memory guided him. Past the hedge Deborah once complained about. up the steps he'd repaired twice over the years. The back door wasn't where his focus went. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he circled to the side, to the small basement window that had always stuck unless you lifted it just right. It opened without complaint. The house smelled different now. Citrus cleaner layered over expensive cologne. But beneath it all, Steve caught the faint echo of what used to be home. He ignored it. Sentiment was noise. He moved through the basement quietly, listening. The hum of conversation above. Glassware clinking. Donald's voice carried easily, confident, practiced, telling a story Steve couldn't hear the end of. Steve took the stairs two at a time, stopping at the landing. He knew where Donald worked. Knew the room he'd converted into a home office under the pretense of managing assets. The door was locked. Steve didn't swear, didn't force it. He reached up and pulled the smoke detector down gently, just enough to retrieve the spare key taped inside. Deborah had always hated clutter. Donald liked contingencies. The office opened to him like a confession. The desk was immaculate. Too immaculate. No clutter meant intention. Steve closed the door softly behind him and went straight to the filing cabinet. The first drawer held real estate. The second held investments. The third drawer was labeled personal. Steve opened it. Custody documents sat on top, copies, some notarized, some not. Names jumped out at him. Children. Ages. Notes in the margins. Mother unstable. Father absent. Expedite authority transfer. Steve's jaw tightened. He flipped deeper. Timelines appeared next. Charts. Projections. A spreadsheet titled Dependents. Columns tracked age, policy value, risk window, and something labeled exit. Steve's breath slowed, deliberate. Insurance projections followed. Clean graphs showing payout ranges depending on cause of death. Notes attached. Natural causes preferable. Accident acceptable. Avoid scrutiny. This wasn't opportunism. It was planning. Steve moved to the desk and opened the laptop. It was unlocked. Donald liked control. He didn't expect intrusion. Folders filled the screen. Steve clicked one labeled contingencies. Inside were subfolders. One read media, another legal, another Nash. Steve stared at it for a long second before opening it. His name appeared in bold at the top of a document. Below it, bullet points. Military background. Potential instability after loss. High risk if mobilized. There were notes on how to discredit him, how to frame him as volatile, how to preemptively neutralize complaints by questioning his mental health. A draft email sat at the bottom, unsent, addressed to a local psychiatrist. Steve closed the file carefully. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. He froze, listening. Laughter. Someone knocked on the bathroom door. The footsteps moved away. Steve continued. Another folder contained photos. Children at playgrounds. School pickup lines. Images taken from across streets, through car windows. Steve felt something cold slide into place behind his eyes. Donald wasn't waiting for tragedy. He was cultivating it. Steve copied what he could, documents, screenshots, timestamps, working quickly but methodically. He didn't take everything. Only what mattered. Only what told the story. A voice rose outside the office door, Donald's. Just ridiculous how some people think money solves everything, he was saying, laughter following. Steve shut the laptop and returned it to exactly how he'd found it. He slid the files back into place, aligning edges. No disturbance. No trace. Before leaving, his eyes caught one last document clipped to the inside of the drawer. Next quarter Outlook names were listed. 2 were highlighted. 1 was circled. A widow. Children noted. Steve memorized it. He closed the drawer. The dinner party was louder now. Music turned up. Someone clapped. Steve slipped back into the hallway, timing his exit between bursts of noise. He paused at the top of the stairs and glanced once toward the living room. Deborah stood near the fireplace, smiling at something Donald said. She looked relaxed. Safe. Steve didn't feel anger, just distance. He left the way he came, the house swallowing his presence without a sound. Outside, the night air felt sharp and clean. Steve crossed the street and didn't look back until he was in his car. He sat there for a moment, hands on the wheel, replaying what he'd seen. Forged custody documents. future victim timelines, insurance projections, contingency plans, some of them written with his name on them. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was infrastructure. Steve started the engine. This wasn't revenge. It was prevention. Chapter 9. When the predator feels cornered. Steve didn't sleep that night. He sat at a small desk in his motel room, laptop open, fingers hovering over keys. The evidence from Donald's private files was a map of cruelty, every custody forgery, every insurance projection, every contingency plan neatly filed like trophies. But trophies for whom? Not for Donald. For Steve, they were a weapon. He typed, paused, deleted, retyped. He needed precision. Mistakes would cost lives. Finally, he found a secure, anonymous email portal. He uploaded the documents in layers, encrypting everything. Then he drafted a message. The system failed the child. The pattern is deliberate. Follow the breadcrumbs. Public records, medical anomalies, legal irregularities. See for yourself. Steve double-checked the attachments. Custody papers, timelines, insurance charts, photographs of children, notes on himself. Names redacted were necessary, but enough detail to force investigation. He hesitated only a second. Then he pressed send. Minutes later, his phone buzzed. No number, no text, just a notification. Delivery confirmed. He exhaled, a slow release of tension. And then he waited. The next morning, the news began to trickle in. Headlines blurred together. Wealthy businessman under federal scrutiny for suspicious deaths, insurance payouts, and child deaths. Investigations underway. Multiple families speak out against Donald Fox. Steve didn't watch too closely. He couldn't. He had work elsewhere. By the third day, panic had seeped into Donald's carefully constructed life. Steve could see it in the local reports. Donald canceled appearances, avoided familiar routes, and his staff moved with a jittery precision. Steve heard first from Rita. She called from a burner phone, voice low, urgent. "Steve, they know something's happening," she whispered. "Donald, he's moving." "What do you mean?" Steve asked. He's taken actions. Dangerous ones." Steve leaned against the motel wall, listening to traffic, the faint hum of neon signs. "Actions like?" "I don't know all of them," Rita admitted. "But a doctor, one of the ones who was supposed to testify, he's dead. Shot in his office. Another journalist disappeared. And me, they're after me." Steve's hands clenched the phone. "Where are you?" "I can't tell you," she said. "Not safe." Steve's jaw tightened. "You will be. I'll make sure of it." The line went dead. Steve held the phone in his hand for a long moment, knuckles white. Donald Fox was escalating. Predictable. Calculated. Dangerous. Steve thought back to the files, contingency plans, exit strategies, timelines. Some of them mentioned journalists, some doctors, and some, the horrifying part, mentioned Steve. This wasn't speculation anymore. These are concrete threats. Steve didn't panic. He didn't need to. He had no one to argue with. He had no one to reassure him. There was only one thing to do. Anticipate the predator's next move. He began plotting quietly, mapping movements, cross-referencing media reports, locations, dates, and possible escape routes. He visualized Donald's likely paths. Dinner parties, meetings, charity events, children in the orbit of danger. Steve clenched his jaw. The children. Innocent lives were about to be caught in the crossfire. He could not allow that. Not again. Hours later, he drove past a school district building and noticed a familiar car idling near the corner. He slowed, letting the engine hum under his hand, studying the license plate. Clean, private, rented. He made a mental note and moved on. Then he stopped at a bridge overlooking a small creek. The city lights reflected off the water. He stared down at the current, thinking, analyzing. Donald had panicked. That meant mistakes were being made. Timelines would slip. One wrong move, and a system he had manipulated for years could unravel. Steve imagined the threads of Donald's network. Lawyers, doctors, social workers, all pressured, all human, and all vulnerable if approached correctly. He picked up his phone again, dialing another burner number. Someone answered almost immediately. "Steve." "Yes," he said. "Listen carefully." I need information on any children currently under Fox's influence. Names, schools, caregivers. Any gaps in observation schedules. A pause. You can handle this alone? I can, Steve said. And I will. By late evening, Steve had assembled a preliminary list. Addresses. Names. Probable times when children would be most exposed. He marked them silently, methodically, just as he would have done before a mission overseas. The calmness in his planning surprised him. Not relief, not satisfaction, just focus. Then came the reports of Donald's latest act. He had kidnapped Rita, the one person who had stayed with Toby until the end. Steve felt the familiar hollow press against his chest. But there was no time for despair. Steve couldn't wait for the law. Federal investigations were slow. Papers had to be filed, warrants had to be granted, bureaucrats had to argue over procedure. Every hour wasted was a potential life in jeopardy. He drove through the city streets, eyes scanning constantly, mind calculating. One day he would need to intercept. One day he would need to act. He had to anticipate every variable. He called Denise Marr next, checking in quietly without revealing his plan. They're moving, she said, voice tight. Rita's gone. Another journalist vanished. Children, I don't know where. I know, Steve said. I'm working on it. You can't. I will, Steve interrupted. This isn't about revenge anymore. It's about stopping him. Silence on the other end. Denise's exhale sounded like a prayer and a warning at once. Steve hung up and stared out the windshield. He didn't flinch at the sirens passing by, nor at the distant sound of helicopters searching for someone or something. Donald had made a crucial error. He believed fear alone could protect him. Steve didn't rely on fear. He relied on observation, patience, and strategy. He opened the laptop again. News articles scrolled across the screen. Federal agencies were now involved. Investigators were asking questions. Anonymous tips, leaked documents. Steve's fingerprints were invisible, but his impact was undeniable. And yet the children remained at risk. The law moved slowly, too slowly. Steve's hand hovered over the mouse. He clicked through each file, each note, each photo he had managed to copy during the infiltration. Every contingency Donald had planned for himself or for others was now in Steve's hands. Every loophole, every vulnerability noted in meticulous handwriting. He leaned back in the chair. A predator cornered became dangerous. Steve had read that in more ways than one. But a predator cornered and observed, meticulously tracked, strategically exposed, was also predictable. And Steve had time. Outside, the wind rustled trash along the deserted motel parking lot. Steve closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, imagining Toby calling his name again, remembering the helplessness he'd felt when he couldn't be there. Not again. Steve opened his eyes and began planning his next steps. Donald Fox had escalated. Kidnapped Rita, murdered a doctor, made a journalist disappear, and the children, innocent, unaware, vulnerable, were once again in immediate danger. The law was moving too slowly. Chapter 10, What a Father Does When Systems Fail. Steve drove through the city in near silence, engine purring like a restrained predator. Streetlights flickered against the windshield, casting patterns that reminded him of the night patrols overseas, of rooftops and alleyways where misstep could cost lives. He was not a man acting on grief anymore. That Steve, broken, hollow, grieving, had died the night he learned Toby was gone. Now he was something else. A barrier, a force with one unshakable directive. Prevent further deaths. He reviewed the files again. Custody forgeries, insurance calculations, contingency plans, and the names of children Donald Fox had set his sights on. Each document was a map, a puzzle, a warning. Each note about his own life reminded him of the stakes. Fox was methodical, but he was not infallible. Every plan had a hole, a timing gap, a point where a father willing to act could intercept. Steve pulled into a deserted parking garage and parked in the shadow of a concrete pillar. The hum of the city above was distant, muted. He took the laptop from the passenger seat and opened the files he had copied during his infiltration. He worked quickly, fingers moving like a pianist's, cross-referencing addresses, school schedules, medical appointments. He made calls, Not hurried, not frantic, but precise. Are the children's locations confirmed? He asked into a burner phone. Yes, Denise replied. Her voice was tight, almost trembling but firm. We've been tracking movements. School drop-offs, extracurriculars, nothing out of place for now. Good, Steve said. Maintain surveillance, but don't engage. I will handle the threat directly. Steve, what you're about to do. I know what I am, he interrupted. I am not a vigilante. I am the line. That line is all that stands between a predator and more victims. There was silence, then Denise said, I trust you. Steve hung up and leaned back, closing his eyes for a brief moment. Tactical patience, he reminded himself. Calm assessment. Measure. Precision. Rage was the luxury of the untrained. He had no room for that. Every step was deliberate, every breath controlled. By midnight, he had prepared his route to Donald's temporary safe house, a secluded rental far outside city limits, chosen for isolation and quick escape. He parked several blocks away, using shadows and alleyways to approach. Every streetlight, every security camera, every reflective surface became data points. He advanced slowly, almost invisible, muscles coiled like springs, senses alert. He reached the perimeter fence. Donald had not expected this. Not a man like Steve, disciplined, trained, and relentless. Steve climbed over silently, landing in the dark mulch without a sound. He moved along the property line, noting guards, cameras, and lighting gaps. The back door, he had already memorized its lock pattern from the blueprint he'd obtained during his infiltration, was unguarded. Inside, the house smelled of expensive perfume and fresh linens. The hum of an air purifier blended with faint music from a hidden speaker. Steve moved methodically, checking each doorway, listening for movement, watching shadows. He found Rita in a small office, tied to a chair, gagged. Her eyes widened as he appeared. Steve, she whispered through the cloth. Relief and fear collided in her gaze. Quiet, Steve said, working quickly to cut the ropes. You're safe now. I've got this. Her hands trembled as she rubbed her wrists. Steve scanned the room. Files and laptops scattered across the desk. Donald's contingency plans. Timelines. Notes. Everything still intact. Everything still actionable. Outside the office, Steve could hear footsteps. Donald returning, unaware of the breach. Steve crouched, sliding along the wall, observing the patterns. He didn't hesitate. Donald appeared in the hallway. Casual, smiling, oblivious. You shouldn't be here, he said, voice smooth, almost amused. Neither should you, Steve replied evenly. Donald's smile faltered. I have everything under control. You've lost your boy. This is pointless. Steve's eyes didn't leave him. Toby isn't here. But you're about to see what happens when systems fail. Donald's amusement snapped into calculation. He took a step back, gesturing toward the door. You can't stop what's already in motion. I can, Steve said, moving deliberately, forcing Donald to step backward into the light. And I will. Donald's plan faltered under Steve's focus. Every contingency he had relied on, to intimidate, to misdirect, to manipulate, was now useless against someone who had studied him, anticipated him, and accepted that failure was no longer tolerable. Steve kept his voice calm, controlled. You've built networks. You've manipulated people. But there are limits. Rules you thought didn't apply to anyone else apply to you. Donald's eyes flicked to the office. He realized the laptop open, the files exposed. His advantage, the secrecy, the infrastructure was gone. You think this is justice? Donald said, tone rising. This is vengeance. No, Steve replied. This is necessity. This is stopping a man who will kill again if left unchecked. This isn't about anger. This is about children. The words hit harder than any blow could. Donald's hand shook. For the first time, Steve saw him vulnerable, calculating risk in real time, recognizing the precision with which he had been outmaneuvered. Steve stepped closer, eyes cold, unwavering. Toby's name is not a memory to be used for your gain. I will honor it by preventing this from happening again. You taught me that lesson. Donald swallowed. No retort came. Steve's presence, his stillness, the inevitable confrontation, It all conveyed more than words could. Justice didn't need screaming. It didn't need chaos. It needed structure, strategy, consequences administered deliberately, surgically, without collateral harm. He took the files and destroyed them carefully, copying what needed to reach authorities, but erasing the contingency plans that could manipulate or endanger more lives. Every page returned to the system or neutralized. Every note on timelines or insurance schemes rendered inert. Rita watched silently, understanding what this meant. Not vengeance, not spectacle, controlled resolution. Steve looked at Donald one last time. You built a system where children died, where lives were treated as currency. You miscalculated. I am a line you could not cross without consequences. Remember that. He turned, signaling Rita to follow, and left the house the way he had entered, quietly, precisely, without leaving a trace of panic or chaos behind. Outside, the night air carried a subtle sharpness. Steve breathed it in steady. The city lights stretched before him, shadows retreating under the glow. He called Denise. The files are secured. Evidence is in motion. The children are safe for now. Steve, she said. Relief and exhaustion mingled in her voice. They'll remain safe, Steve said, because I will not allow them to be used again. Toby's name will be honored, not forgotten, not exploited. He ended the call and looked out at the streets. The long fight wasn't over. There would always be vigilance, always attention. But for the first time, Steve felt the line between tragedy and prevention held firm. He wasn't a grieving father anymore. He wasn't just a soldier. He wasn't acting out of anger. He was the barrier between a predator and innocent lives, and he had chosen that role with clarity, purpose, and control. Toby's name echoed in his mind, not as a cry for help, but as a call to action that had been answered. Justice had been served, not as chaos, but as inevitability. And for Steve, that was enough.